Key Biscayne, Florida, June 1964. We're on a barrier island just south of Miami. The kind of place people with money go to buy quiet, water views, and distance from the city's problems. One of those apartments belonged to a man named Jacques Mossler. On paper, he was the definition of successful. A millionaire financier with business interests based in Houston, and a personal life that stretched into Florida. He had money, status, influence, and a long list of people who loved him, needed him, feared him, resented him. One night in June of 1964, all that ended in his bedroom on Key Biscayne. When officers went into his apartment, they didn't find a man who died in his sleep. They walked into a homicide. Jacques had been struck in the head with a blunt object, and get this, stabbed over 30 times. I'm Vince Velasquez, and this is Crime Traveler. Let's work this case like a homicide detective. Key Biscayne at night is quiet. You hear the wind, the water, a car now and then going over the causeway. So when that quiet breaks, people remember. Neighbors later reported hearing the Mosler's dog barking nonstop. That's not paperwork, that's behavior. Dogs know routine. They know what footsteps belong and which ones don't. Then came the voice. At least one witness said a man shouted, don't do that to me." That tells you that the victim was conscious and knew what was happening. He likely knew exactly who was in that room with him. Outside, witnesses remember movement. A man leaving the area. A white car parked nearby that only now seems important after a body's found. Whoever killed Jacques didn't vanish into thin air. Somebody walked out, got into that car, and drove away before the sun came up. First question in a case like this is usually the simplest. Was this a burglary? Older, wealthy man, luxury apartment. On paper, he looks like a great target for thieves. Maybe someone watched his comings and goings. Maybe they thought he kept cash and jewelry. You have to check that out. You look for forced entry, broken locks, pried doors, damaged windows. You look for ransacking. Drawers empty, closets torn apart, safe disturbed. Then you put that next to what was done to the body. A head blow with a heavy object, followed by more than 30 stab wounds. This isn't a single blow and a quick escape. That's sustained, close-range violence. Whoever did this stayed on him until they were certain he wasn't getting back up. Some accounts show him on the floor wrapped or partly wrapped in a blanket, as if someone tried clumsily to cover the aftermath. That's not the typical signature of a burglar who panics and runs. Most burglars avoid contact entirely. When they do get surprised, they just swing and leave. Here, somebody stayed. They kept applying force over and over. So you move past the easy theory. You stop asking who broke in. You start asking who was close enough to this man to stand over him and unleash this much violence. The first person you look at is the person closest on paper, his wife. Candace "Candy" Mosler. Younger than Jacques, photogenic, glamorous. Already the subject of quiet gossip before any of this. By the time of the murder, their marriage was already strained. Some reports say they were effectively already separated, even if the paperwork hadn't caught up. Candy told police she came home and found Jacques dead. Early on, she suggested that he was killed in a burglary. But detectives had just cleared that bedroom. They'd seen the wounds. It didn't feel like a broke-in and panicked type of job. As they kept questioning her, Candy's story shifted. She floated the idea that Jacques may have been involved with another man, and that jealousy or some other type of entanglement could explain the attack. When a spouse changes their explanation like that, you pay attention. You don't automatically decide they're the killer, but you stop treating them as a reliable narrator. From that point on, every statement gets tested against the evidence. Where she was, who saw her, what calls she made. What you're looking for are gaps. because gaps are where homicides hide. The wider picture around Jacques' life wasn't clean. He had wealth, he had business interests in Houston, a life split between cities and states. Men like that collect friction, from business deals, from family resentments, from romantic or sexual history that doesn't match the public image. Once Candy brought up the idea of another man, detectives had to widen the circle. They looked past the marriage and into everything surrounding it. One early name that came up was interior decorator, a guy named Fred Weissel. He moved in Jacques' wider social world, and he also drove a white car. Now this gets a little interesting. On the same night that Jacques was murdered, Weissel's found about 6 miles away, bloodied and beaten. A man on the edge of the victim's life, injured the same night, driving a car that matches what neighbors saw. That's a real lead in any squad room. So detectives dug into him, but as statements and physical evidence came together, the line from Weissel back into Jacques' bedroom never really lined up. So his assault stayed in the file, but the main focus shifted inward, toward family. That's where Melvin Lane Powers steps forward. Not Jacques' nephew, Candy's, her biological nephew, the son of her sister, Elizabeth Babe Powers. In 1961, Babe asked Candy for some help. You see, her son was in some legal trouble. He needed a place and a second chance, so to speak.
He can stay here as long as he needs.
So Candy and Jacques brought him into their world. Mel moved into their mansion in Houston, lived under their roof, and went to work in one of Jacques' businesses. He wasn't just a relative. He became part of the household, with access to their money, their schedule, and their habits. When detectives made it to Houston, they treated him like someone who knew how the Moslers lived. They asked him where he'd been the night Jacques was killed. Well, Mel said he'd been in Houston, but at a movie. Let's talk about that. A movie's a simple alibi. You should know the theater, you should know the title. Mel couldn't give any of that. That doesn't convict him, but it does turn routine interview to, we've got to check everything he says. In the 1960s, they didn't have online records. They had paper. So detectives went to the airlines and they pulled manifests for flights on the night of the murder between Houston and Miami. They talked to ticket agents, gate agents, flight attendants. Later reports say that a ticket agent remembered selling a seat on a Miami-bound flight to Mel, and a flight attendant reported to actually see him on board. Well, that turned his Houston alibi into a big fat lie. Now, they could actually place him on a plane to Miami on the day that Jacques was killed. From an investigative standpoint, that's a big shift. When a suspect lies about which city they were in, you assume they're hiding more than just forgetfulness. You start building a minute-by-minute timeline of everything they did and everywhere they were. Witnesses then place Mel even closer. They say they saw him at a bar near Jacques' Key Biscayne apartment on the night of the murder. Some reported he asked for an empty Coke bottle to take with him. On most nights, that's a throwaway detail. But in a case where your victim's head has been struck with a blunt object, you don't ignore a man asking for an empty Coke bottle just a short distance from the crime scene. Inside the Key Biscayne apartment, investigators reportedly found a fingerprint linked to Mel. Now, remember, Mel had lived with the Moslers in Houston. He'd been inside their world. So on his face, that print could be explained as residual family contact. He'd been close enough that his print might legitimately show up on some of the things within the Moslers' home. But when you lay that print against the false Houston alibi, the documented flight into Miami, and witnesses who say they saw him near the building, it stops looking harmless and starts looking like one more gear in the same machine. Then came the car. Neighbors reported seeing a white car near the scene that night. Well, later, detectives found a white Chevy abandoned at Miami International Airport. And it wasn't just any car off the lot. According to case accounts, records show that it was a loaner tied to one of the Moslers' companies. And here's the kicker. It was last checked out to Candy Mosler. And it appears to be the same type of car neighbors reported seeing the night of the homicide. So detectives process the Chevy, looking for evidence. They find latent prints and some blood. Later tests confirmed at least one of the prints matched Mel Powers, and the blood found in the vehicle was consistent with the blood type of the victim, Jacques. So before a jury ever sat down, the file on Powers held this: a weak false alibi in Houston, airline staff putting him on a plane to Miami, barred witnesses putting him within walking distance of Jacques' apartment, a fingerprint in the apartment itself, a white Chevy tied back to the Moslers, in particular Candy, found at the airport with a fingerprint matching Powers, and blood the same type as the victim. That's the sort of chain you want in place before you ever start using the word murder in front of a grand jury. Then detectives had uncovered a part of the story that no one has put on paper yet. Candy and Mel weren't just aunt and nephew. They were lovers. An incestuous affair that prosecutors would later put in front of a jury. For investigators, that detail didn't just make headlines. It changed motive. Now you had a wealthy husband, a younger wife, her biological nephew living in the house in Houston, and a secret relationship between those two younger people. That's a triangle with pressure added. You start to see how Jacques can move from being an inconvenience to more of an obstacle. The case against Candy tightened on three main fronts: money, timing, and what witnesses said that she and Mel said to some other men. On the money side, some accounts say that if Candy divorced Jacques, she'd walk away with far less than she'd receive if she was his widow. That turns a bad marriage into a financial incentive. On the timing, Candy and the children were away from the crime scene during the time of the murder. Her late night movements and what detectives uncovered as some kind of crazy conversations with different men. On words prosecutors later called a Texas thief, a drug addict, an ex-con, who testified that Candy, and in some accounts Candy and Mel together, had approached them about killing Jacques for money long before the Key Biscayne murder. These weren't clean witnesses. These were exactly the type of men that defense attorneys can attack, but they all described the same pattern. Conversations about Jacques dying, about money, about making it look like something other than a straight-up hit. You don't take that at face value. You work each one. When did this happen? Where? What amount was discussed? What did they know about Jacques' travel pattern? Which of those answers line up with the real records? Phone calls, tickets, hotel stays. You expect some stories to fall apart. But if different men who don't know each other put the same two names, Candy and Mel, in the middle of a murder-for-hire conversations, and at least some of those details match what's on paper, their stories suggest the idea of killing Jacques had been picked up and put down way before it ever became a reality. And to that, add Jacques' own words. According to later accounts, Jacques actually wrote in a diary or a memo pad something along the lines of, "If Mel and Candace don't kill me first, I'll have to kill them." And from that, you can see how he read danger into his own life as investigators now did. All of that, the movement, the car, the fingerprint, the incestuous affair, the financial motive, and the men who said that Candy and sometimes Candy and Mel tried to hire them, eventually went to a Dade County grand jury. Powers was naturally the first target, a younger male relative you could actually physically place in Florida with evidence tying him to the scene and to the car. He was indicted in Florida, arrested in Houston, and brought back to Florida to face charges. As investigators continued to develop their case against Candy, her relationship with Mel, the money incentive, the murder-for-hire testimony, a second Dade County grand jury returned an indictment against Candy Mosler herself. By then, Candy was in Rochester, Minnesota, getting treatment at the Mayo Clinic. Instead of hauling her out of a hospital hallway in handcuffs, authorities arranged for her to come back on her own and surrender. She flew into Miami wearing a hospital wristband, escorted by a private nurse, and walked off that plane into a wall of cameras. Reporters hit her with every label at once: adultery, incest, murder. Candy smiled and then gave them a line that would stick to this case forever. Well, nobody's perfect. With Mel under arrest and Candy freshly indicted, The stage was set for one of the wildest trials Miami had ever seen. When the trial opened in January 1966, it ran nearly 7 weeks. The courtroom was packed day after day. On paper, the trial was about one man dead in a Key Biscayne bedroom. In practice, though, it became a show about money, sex, power, and taboo. Jurors heard about her incestuous affair between her and her biological nephew, Mel. They heard claims that Mel had actually bragged about Candy and made statements that she was pregnant with his child. They heard about the travel records, the flight from Houston to Miami. They saw the state's case of the white Chevy tied back to the Mossler family checked out to Candy. That same car found abandoned in Miami with Mel's fingerprints inside, as well as Jacques' blood type. They heard about Mel's fingerprint inside of Jacques' apartment, and how Mel's lies turned that one print into something bigger. They listened to the thief, the addict, the ex-con, all who testified that Mel, and sometimes Mel and Candy together, approached them asking them to kill Jacques for money. Then came the defense. Both Candy and Mel were represented by high-priced and well-experienced criminal defense attorneys from Houston. These attorneys had an abundance of experience in capital cases in keeping people off of death row. These attorneys just didn't defend. They attacked the state's witnesses, hammering their addictions, their criminal records, their deals with prosecutors. They pointed out the inconsistencies the state hadn't already explained. They told the jury not to believe the words of junkies, thieves, ex-cons over the freedom of their clients. Closing arguments lasted well over 6 hours, depending on which accounts you read. By the time defense lawyers sat down, they accomplished what great defense lawyers do. They didn't prove anyone innocent. They gave the jury a comfortable place to park their doubt. The 12-man jury took the case and went behind closed doors. They stayed there for 16 hours and 44 minutes. That isn't a quick vote, that's a long argument. On March 6, 1966, they came back. Not guilty for Candace Candy Mosler. Not guilty for Melvin Lane Powers. No one was convicted for the murder of Jacques Mosler. There were no sentences, no prison time. In the eyes of the law, they walked out clean. Life after the murder didn't look like most murder cases either. After the trial, Candy and Mel left the courthouse together. And for a few years, they lived together in her Houston mansion before finally going their separate ways. In 1976, Candy was found in her Miami apartment, dead from an overdose of prescription pills. Mel went on to work as a real estate developer, ran into some more legal trouble, including fraud cases, and died in 2010 in his Houston home. Jacques never saw any of that. For him, the story ended in that bedroom on Key Biscayne. What came after, the headlines, the trial, the years Candy and Mel spent together, and their separate endings all played out without him. If I'd been working this case in 1964, my job wouldn't have been to out-talk the defense team. It would have been to build a case so disciplined that no amount of courtroom showmanship could shake it loose. I'd treat the timeline like a separate crime scene. Every ticket, every manifest entry, every cab ride, every hotel ledger, every long-distance call between Candy and Mel. I'd also treat that white Chevy as its own case file. Who checked it out, when it moved? Who saw it at the building? Who saw it at the airport? I put Mel's fingerprint in the apartment in the context of his life, a nephew who lived in their home in Houston. Then show the jury how his false alibi turned that fingerprint into more of a contradiction that the evidence had to correct. On the money, I'd strip the story to numbers. What Candy had with Jacques alive, and what she stood to gain as his widow. All backed up with records and people who understood those accounts. On the relationship, I'd lean in on witnesses who didn't benefit. Maids, relatives, employees, neighbors. And I'd document every lie that Candy and Mel told to cover what they were. On the murder-for-hire stories, I talked to every man who said he was approached. But I'd only trust the ones I could tie to dates, phone calls, travel. But the goal isn't a perfect case. There's no such thing. The goal is to narrow the story until the evidence keeps telling the same pattern over and over again, with no regard of who tries to talk around it. Jacques Mosler's murder began as a violent mystery in the dark. A brutal bedroom scene, a barking dog, a man pleading for his life. A white car in the night, a wife whose story changed. A bloodied man found miles away, and a biological nephew with a weak alibi. Step by step, the investigation stopped looking outward and started looking inward. Stay sharp, stay skeptical, and remember, a good liar can cloud a case. A good lawyer can confuse a jury, but the dead still leave patterns for those willing to follow them. I'm Vince Velasquez, and this is Crime Traveler from the Murder Mind. Subscribe to the Murder Mind and hit that like button so you never miss an episode. And check out our other videos where I take you inside my own homicide investigations. Until then, keep your mind on murder.